Ja, weil wir weiterhin versuchen, das ordentlich zu machen. Was ich nur gar nicht. Aber nicht viel. Ja, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren,
Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue.
wir machen weiter im Programm.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue with our presentations.
Vielleicht können Sie einfach sich hinsetzen.
Please be seated. Please be seated and stop your little workshops. You're working in groups and listen to the stage. We know that some of you just joined because they registered for the afternoon, so we'll quickly summarize the morning if you've just arrived. So this morning we've heard 4 presentations, one about the history of Jews in Landau, the history of Jews that lived in Landau, and the relationship between Landau citizens and Jews that were part of society. We heard a second presentation on the Palatinate wine culture, and the third presentation was about the Jewish wine culture, which ran in parallel in the medieval times. And in the third and fourth presentation, we heard about wine trade and the meaning for the Palatinate economy at the end of the 19th century and 20th century. It was very meaningful. And now we'll come back to Landau and we'll answer the question of the influence of Jewish wine merchants on Landau. And the presentation now focuses on that question: what happened after the city became less fortified and the city developed as a city and grew as a city? And what was the meaning of the Jewish wine merchants? What was the role of the Jewish wine traders and merchants? We were trying to find a presenter for this for a long time. It wasn't easy to find someone because it's very specific. And I stumbled upon the, what is it called again? The Atlas? Atlas of Wine Culture. And the sponsor of that Atlas of Wine Culture is the Institute for Historic Research. We heard Dr. Engelen, and she is a member of that institute as well. And I stumbled upon a name, Felix Maskov. He also works at this institute. And he has written a lot about the German wine gate, German Weintor. And I thought that was very interesting. And then I asked him to research the history of Landau and this very specific history. And I went around with him, around Landau with him, and we looked at a few houses together. So this is very specific, and it clearly emphasizes the influence of Jewish wine merchants on the development of the city of Landau. Mr. Maskov, you have the floor. A warm welcome from my side as well. Thank you for coming. Thank you for so many people. A lot of things that I will tell you, you might have heard them. You might have heard that before. We heard a lot about Jewish wine culture and wine trade in Palatinate. And I want to connect that, and I might want to continue and elaborate on that a little bit. As you can see, my presentation is titled The History of Jewish Wine Merchants in Landau and the Palatinate from the 19th century and the early 20th century. But before I start, I want to talk about the Jewish wine trade before that period and find a few words of introduction. And that presentation that you will see will just run alongside. I have lots of pictures, very current photographs of the buildings that used to belong to former Jewish wine merchants. So after the foundation of the German emperor in 1871, and after the city became less fortified, the city of Landau became meaningful and arose to regional fame for the wine trade. And in the medieval times and in early modern times, from the 16th century on, it had a specific meaning as a wine trading region, but it was outgrown by cities that were right along the River Rhine, like Worms, Speyer, and Strasbourg. And then there were the wars of the 17th century, and the meaning of Landau decreased again, and Dr. Engelingen showed us that there's only a relatively short period of time where Landau blossomed as a wine trading center, and that is the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Just to put out some numbers, in 1903 there were 80 shops, 15,000 citizens, both Jewish and non-Jewish wine traders. 80. So the city and the rise of the city of Landau to become an important wine trading center it was due to Jewish wine merchants. Between 1871 to 1938, it clearly marked Landau and helped Landau to rise to fame. And you'll also see that it marked the architecture of the city of Landau. As Dr. Engling already mentioned, Angelika Pichotta is important to mention. She did her doctorates on that for the meaning of the Jewish wine merchants. It started in the early 2000s and onwards. So this part of London's history was only mentioned or forgotten until now. But when we talk about numbers of statistics and just family fates and history of individual companies are rather dark blind spots of the history of Landau, and there's a lot of potential to research these. We know about the framework a lot, but we don't know a lot about companies' histories. And I tried to give a few examples. We heard from the Landau family before and heard their story. And I want to give a few more examples from the Jewish wine trade in Landau. And Mr. Krieger will elaborate on that later regarding the German research in wine trade and the Jewish involvement. The Jewish participation was either left out completely or not mentioned at all. And the research focuses on the end of the 19th century, and anti-Semitism was around back then, so they didn't include that. And there was propaganda from 1938 on, and so it always says that in a lot of cities or regions, Jewish merchants had a monopoly on wine trade. But this is a generic statement, and that cannot be underpinned. There are high figures where it says that 80% of the Jewish merchants dominated the history, but that cannot be proven. So there's not much research about Landau or Neustadt an der Weinstraße or Palatinate. So that was a few words of introduction, but now I want to talk about the development for decades and centuries. I want to start with the Middle Ages, as we've already heard. The opportunities for Jews to engage in agricultural and commercial activities was severely restricted by individual provincial and municipal rulers and the guilds, which forced Jews in many places into professions such as livestock, small goods trade, or money lending, as was also the case in Landau. One exciting number, 1541, the Landau Town Council granted permission for the 100 or so Jews at the time to serve wine for an annual fee of 6 guilders, but only serving wine, not trading with wine. The Jews in Landau were not allowed to trade wine. In the course of the revolutionary wars following the French Revolution and Napoleon's rule over Landau, which had been France since 1790, the Jews now had gained full citizenship. However, there were 2 decrees, Napoleon decrees 1806 and 1808, which led to economic restrictions, especially in the Palatinate. So Jews were only allowed to settle in the Palatinate if they were landowners and farmers. But this did not change the Jewish occupational structure. Jews only worked as part-time farmers and wine growers, and they remained involved in livestock trade and the grocery trade. In the context of those mixed businesses, they now also traded in agricultural products, mainly such as wine. But they were only allowed to do so if they acquired a patent after presenting a clearance certificate. So that was agricultural products such as wine, but only within mixed businesses. They could not exclusively specialize on wine because the patents were not granted fairly. So the competitors influenced the decision-making, and usually Jews were not granted those patents. It was not until 1851 that the Palatinate on the left bank of the Rhine, which had belonged to Bavaria since, achieved civil and thus also economic equality for Jews. This, as well as the delayed industrialization and urbanization in the Palatinate, significantly accelerated the increasing internal migration of Jews from the surrounding rural areas. In particular, wine-growing villages Albersweiler, Ingenheim, Böchingen, and Essingen, and they moved to the cities of Kaiserslautern, Speyer, and Landau, which were connected to railways. Therefore, the Jewish population grew considerably, as we have heard before. This was also accompanied by a certain economic rise of the Palatinate Jews. We see that in the Jewish economic activities as well. We can see that the Jews in the Palatinate continued to focus on trade, but they also increased that to retail and wholesale in mixed goods, agricultural goods. And the Jewish merchants adapted extremely flexibly to regional consumer needs by trading primarily with locally produced products such as leather, tobacco, wood, hops, and also wine. With the founding of the German Empire in 1871, all Jewish citizens achieved full civic equality, which further intensified the Jewish urban migration process in the Palatinate. The Jewish population of Landau grew by almost 60% between 1885 and 1900. Oh, this comes later, sorry. Give me a second. Whether that was a Jewish wine merchant or not, we unfortunately don't know, but this is what it looked like. Wine barrels by the end of the 19th century and transport. One strong factor was the urban development that triggered Landau's development into an important wine trading town. So that was the factor that Landau became less fortified. Since the Middle Ages, the town settlement and the economic area had not been able to expand due to the ban on building outside of the fortress. However, industrialization and the demographic and economic growth that came with it had practically bypassed Landau. The fortification of Landau, which began in 1872 and whose fortification were no longer needed after the Franco-Prussian War, and the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, it was not a bordering region to France anymore, and the economy was restricted because it was fortified. And then that decision was made to take down the fortifications. And for Landau, that was a very important decision, and it gave rise to industrialized areas, more transport infrastructure, and new districts. So the railway used to be outside of the city gates, and now it was inside, and the train station was moved inside or integrated into the new city. As mentioned before, the railway was built from Gervesheim-Landau-Zweibrücken in 1872 to 1874, which significantly expanded the sales area of Landau's tradesmen and in particular wine as well. The areas now freed up by the fortification were sold by the city, and ring roads were laid out along the former fortress ramparts, along which residential and commercial buildings were to be built. However, due to the nationwide founding crisis after 1873, it was not until the mid-1880s that townhouses were built and new villas and commercial trading and warehouse buildings. They were upscale in the southwest and the Marienring, and it was combined. One house was the representative part, and in the back it had the commercial area. So numerous Landau businesses and trading houses moved from the old town to the developing areas along the Ringstraße and the Bahnhofstraße. And lots of companies, Jewish and non-Jewish companies, moved out, and with most of the Jewish wine merchants from the surrounding wine-growing villages moved there directly from the villages. So they didn't go into the old town, they went directly on the outside. There were wine traders in the inside, but they were non-Jewish wine traders on the inside. There were only 2 or 3 Jewish wine traders that were located in the old town first and then moved out. Most of them came from abroad. From Albersweiler, there were 44 wine traders from 1870 to 1910, and they were Jewish companies. So Albersweiler was one of the most important places that people came from, moving to Landau. We've heard most of this again, but many of the Jewish wine merchants who moved to the city had already been active as mixed merchants in the food industry before their arrival. But only when they moved to the city and resettled on the Ringstraße did they have sufficient infrastructural opportunities and storage capacity to expand and specialize in wine business. So they expanded and they specialized. They enlarged their companies, and they used to be mixed merchants, but now they were able to focus on wine in particular. But not all of them did specialize in wine. Lots of them were still mixed merchants, food, wine, and other goods. One example, so that was the slide that you saw before. One example was the Brunner family from Böchingen. Initially based in Landau's old town since the 1860s, one of the few Jewish companies that moved to the old town first. So since the 1860s as a flour, wine, and brandy merchant. So wine was not the only product that they traded. And then the company expanded. It's a very special case. It's not exemplary for the Jewish businesses, but they expanded and they split up into 2 companies. One went to the industrial area as a flour and country product merchant, and country product was wine. And then there was also a permanent wine merchant, A&E Brunner at Kaiserring, nowadays Marienring number 12. And this building, Bernhard Scholten took a lot of these pictures. This is one of the buildings. Unfortunately, it was raining and no sunshine, but as you can see, it's a good building, and you see those buildings were really great. And in the back, you see the chimney. The chimney is not part of it, but the courtyard, you see that there was a nice part of the building, and behind it lay the storage areas. With increasing sales and prosperity, the Jewish wine merchants who now settled in the new ring roads built representative, sometimes magnificent residential company and farm buildings in the upper middle class style of the Wilhelminian era, which some of them still characterize Landau's townscape today, with their cellars in the rear-facing part of the property. As the Ringstraße development progressed from the 1880s onwards, the number of Jewish wine merchants setting up and founding new businesses there also increased. Whereas in the 1870s, there were only 7 Jewish wine merchants. In the 70s, some of them were hesitant. There were only 7 Jewish wine merchants that relocated their businesses. But at the peak of the development in the 1880s, there were already 16, and in the 90s was a total number of 18 Jewish wine merchants in Südmarien and Westring. However, the biggest impetus for a flourishing Jewish wine trade was, as we've heard before, the construction of the Landau industrial track and the Industriestraße from 1891 to 1894 in the east of the city. And that provided a decisive boost for the revival of building activity and around the Landau ring roads, and that's also for the settlement of Jewish wine trading companies, enabling the companies located there to be directly connected to the railroad network. And by 1899, the industrial tracks had been extended to the new construction area of the northern Ostring and Nordring along Industriestraße and from the Nordring to the level of Marktstraße. And this was like an initial spark for the building activities of Jewish wine merchants who moved there between 95 and 97, especially after the extension of the track in the direction of Ruitstraße and Nordring. By 1903, there were already 15 stores of Jewish wine trading companies with sidings. And of the 95 sidings in 26, a total number of 33 were Jewish-owned, of which 17 in turn were accounted for by a total of 12 Jewish wine merchants. So some wine merchants were so big that they had several railroad stations along the line. This is Landau Industrial Rail at the corner to Schlachthofstraße. I'll talk about the building in the back again. It is one of the largest Jewish-owned businesses. That was a beautiful building that you can still see up to this day. You'll recognize it later. So that's the building on the left, behind the rail. And this, again, is an old relic of the industrial rail that you can still see today. They're very hard to find, but every now and then you can see them, still see them. This is Neustädter Straße, the street that had Levi wine merchant, and you can see that the rail directly goes into the building where the barrels and the vats were put onto the railroad. And one example for one of those companies that expanded to Ostway was Marx and Joseph OHG, which built an office, a wine press, and a warehouse building in the Ostring 14 in 1891. Later, a villa was added at Ostring number 12, as well as a winery and a store at Ostbahnstraße 36. Founded by Abraham Marx and the brothers Albert and Emil Joseph. The brothers were wine and colonial goods merchants from Ingenheim. And after the move to the railroad, the company became one of the largest wine merchants, maybe the largest wine merchant in Landau. I have a few numbers, not many, but you'll find out why later on. This is another picture. This is the former Marx and Joseph Company at Ostring 12, 14. Number 12 is on the left and 14 is on the right, and 14 is very impressive. It's a very tall building. They have a foyer, glazed foyer with a gate. It's remarkable. And you can go around and go into the courtyard, and it's a large courtyard with a winery and storage. So it's very impressive. And number 12 was a residential building where people lived, with ornaments on the windows. It looks very impressive, very impressive. Another example is the David Weil Company, which was founded in Albersweiler in 1846 and moved directly to the Landau Industrial Railroad tracks, not going into the Old City first. The first Jewish winery with railroads. In 1879, the Weils were the first Jewish family to build a residential building in Schlachthofstraße 14, the building that I mentioned earlier. And then in 1898, another new building at Schlachthofstraße 16. I have a letterhead here, a letterhead from 1898 of Marx and Joseph. And this is the facade of the building that you saw on the other picture behind the railroad. So you see the Bavarian Court of Arms, the Royal Court of Arms, and on the left and right you see representations of wine and winemaking. And the house is still in a very good condition, and when the sun is shining, the Court of Arms shines golden. So it's really worthwhile to go and take a look at it. The company Leon Levy and Sons, founded in 1880, whose owner came from Edesheim, had also moved to the industrial siding in Landau to expand its business and storage facilities. Levy traded in large quantities in Palatinate wines. There were 3 Levy businesses. This is Levy and Sons, Leon Levy and Sons. In 1887, a residential building and company headquarters were built at Schlossstraße 8. In 1895, they added a wine cellar, and in 1898-99, the company moved into the property at Nordring 27 to 29, also with sidings. Another letterhead, David Weil, dated 1908. In the background, you see the company building as a drawing, and you see the railroad connection, and they're loading barrels onto a train. It's a good representation. And this is the residential building of Leon Levy Söhne Schlossstraße number 8. And as you can see, it's still very impressive. You have an entrance hall with a tower, and then behind that you have a courtyard, and then you see the storage buildings in the back. So all these buildings are built the same. Well, non-Jewish companies had the same style, but the Jewish buildings are very beautiful, and until today they're a very important hallmark of the city. From the 1890s, the number of new buildings around the industrial tract tripled, especially on the Nordring, where the Jewish wine merchants were the first ones, the pioneers to build, and Untertor Street, today Neustädter Straße, and on the corner of Nordring, Ostring, and on said Schlachthofstraße, we had new Jewish wine merchants. Schlachthofstraße had the largest number of Jewish wine merchants. There were 9 new buildings erected by Jewish wine merchants. In contrast to the western and southern ring development, the new Jewish buildings in the industrial quarter were also characterized by the fact that the front gate of the residential and commercial buildings faced the street, while the winery and storage buildings at the rear were directly connected to the tracks. In 1890 to 40 of the wine merchants, 3/4 of the 40 wine merchants were Jewish-owned. And the Jewish share of Landau's wine merchants around 1900 was 60%. In 1905, it was 74% that were Jewish. As late as 35, over half of all Landau wine merchants was Jewish, which is an enormously high density for a town the size of Landau. A total of 12 buildings on the industrial track were permanently used by Jewish wine merchants, whose annual sales volume was probably well over 200 barrels, which is 200,000 liters. And six of the companies were even selling 2,000 barrels. Around 1930, for example, a total of 6 wine shops were concentrated in Schlachthofstraße and at its junction with Nordring, including Haar, Scharf and Son business of the Scharf family from Essingen, which in 1932 was owned by Scharf and Meyer wholesalers in Schlossstraße, and the food and colonial goods and wine wholesaler was H. Scharf and Son, founded in 1875. Many of those companies, however, relocated the company elsewhere in larger cities. And this company moved to the headquarters of Bavaria, Munich. So they moved to Munich. And that was one reason for the decreasing number of Jewish wine merchants in Landau. Scharf and Son traded with consumables, but also with imported wines. So very early on, they concentrated on trading bottled wines and imported foreign wines. The residential and the office building of the company Scharf and Son is maybe not the prettiest, but the most remarkable one, because it's very high. It's a very high residential building. In the back, you'll see the courtyard and the storage areas. And the facade has medallions on it of Bismarck and other important people that symbolize the support of the governing politicians or identification with policymaking at the time, and just maybe the integration into society as a whole. So the latter products in particular reflect the now much stronger orientation of Jewish wine merchants towards the increasingly super-regional bottled and foreign wine trade, which significantly promoted Landau's growing status as an important intermediate trading station between local producers and wholesale trade. For example, Marx and Joseph, the largest player, was able to establish itself in the Rhine Trading Center and traded consumer wines as far as Cologne. Between 30 and 34, the company imported a total number of 1.5 million liters of wine. Leon Levy and Sons David Weil and Martin Philipp and Co. also traded foreign wines on a large scale. Martin Philipp and Co., the latter, had previously focused on consumer wine, but expanded their range to include fine wines after they moved to the industrial railway track. They then diversified their product range and entered the bottled wine business as one of the first Jewish companies. For the period of 30 to 34, sales of over 2 million Reichsmark from imported foreign wines alone are documented for 5 companies. The core part of the business of Landau's Jewish wine merchants, however, continued to be the trade in domestic consumer wine. So most Jewish wine merchants still focused on domestic consumer wine. We can see another ad of Damwood Samuel Weil. Samuel Weil was the business owner, that was the brother. This is another example that I briefly want to mention. I'm already running out of time, but one is Metzger, J.D. and Son at Südring number 10. They had a sales volume of 2.3 million Reichsmark, which was one of 2 Landau wine traders which came back to Landau after the war. The other one was another one named Metzger, so those were the only ones that resettled in Landau in the 70s. Maybe even earlier than that, and actually came back. Before that, in conclusion, while Landau's wine trade was still quite small-scale before the Gründerzeit, the migration of Jewish wine merchants from the surrounding wine-growing villages to the central city of Landau in the course of the city's consolidation and the associated commercial settlement on the ring roads in the 80s and 90s marked a significant stimulus for Landau's wine industry. Compared to their non-Jewish competitors, the Jewish wine merchants of Landau experienced an increased process of capital concentration due to their economic foresight and early expansion into supra-regional sales markets, which was a decisive advantage in times of crisis like undercapitalization, such as the 20s and 30s. As a result, the numerical preponderance of Jewish wine merchants in Landau also developed into an economic presence that clearly exceeded the industry. Due to their expertise, the capital strength, and their local and supra-regional purchasing and distribution networks, the Jewish wine merchants formed central pillars of the Landau wine trade, which can still be seen today in the prestigious buildings on the ring roads and the industrial railroad district. The end of the lively economic activity of Jewish wine merchants in Landau was finally marked by their forcible segregation as a result of the NS takeover in 1933, which also set in motion the irreversible decline of the Landau wine trade. As a result, the great importance that Jewish wine merchants had for the Landau wine industry could not nearly be compensated for by the remaining non-Jewish wine merchants in the course of the Aryanization of their businesses. Thank you very much.
Ja, herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation with numerous pictures. I liked it a lot to walk around Landau and take all those pictures and to learn more about the history of those houses. So the question is, what if? But we do not want to ask that question today, but we want to hear more about the Aryanization in Landau. I have to get ready first. Just give me a second. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Some of you might find it a bit surprising that a historian from the Mosel region is talking about wine trading in the Palatinate and also especially wine trading in the Third Reich. Well, it is by coincidence that I came here today, but when I started dealing with this topic, I realized that it's not that bad to take a look from the outside perspective on the Palatinate. So, well, it is no need to explain people from the Palatinate that the German wine road is only a Palatinate wine road, actually. But my topic today is racial mania and National Socialist wine propaganda, the elimination of Jewish wine trade in the Third Reich. Well, I think about this topic alone, we could have held an own symposium on that topic alone, but I have to say that the National Socialist wine growing policy is a field that has not been analyzed that much. And the National Socialist wine propaganda, so that was the first publication on that topic. So I can't present you any finished results today, and I'm not going to go into detail about Landau today, but I think that I've got some new and interesting aspects for you today. And I have to admit that the biggest challenge when preparing this presentation was the time frame that I was given. Because unfortunately, I have to tell you right away that I won't be able to finish within 20 minutes. So I'm trying to keep it as short as possible because we've got two separate topics here in the title. But I'm going to focus on the first part because I don't have too much time today. So National Socialist wine propaganda is actually my field of expertise. But referring to racial mania, I also want to talk about this specific propaganda area of the Hitler era. And yeah, unfortunately, I can tell you right away that I will have more answers and more questions and answers for you today. So some of the initial statements preserved for quite some time, but on the other hand, some legends also prevailed and were spread afterwards to show the historic links of populist heritage of the NS time. So, for example, the Deutsche Weinstraße, or what might surprise you, my latest field of research, the Deutsche Weinkönigin, the German wine queen. So, let's start right away with the first legend, with the first slide. The previous speaker told it, legend of the market domination of the Jewish wine trade. So if you try to find out more about German wine trade at the NS time, at the time of the National Socialists, it was astonishing. So the author Dieter Graf wrote 2011 in a publication that was published by the Society of Wine Growing in the 1930s, he wrote, in 1933, 80% of the wine trade, including the commission agents, in both the producer and consumer areas, was in Jewish hands. Graf is not referring to the Palatinate wine trade here, but to German wine trade as a whole. The following year, Daniel Deckers explained that in 1933, almost 60% of the wine traded in Germany passed through Jewish hands. Again, we are not talking about the Palatinate or Rhine-Hessian wine trade, but German wine trade as a whole. When I read both figures at the time, my alarm bells immediately went off, as both figures including the 60% figure, which, mind you, doesn't just refer to Rheinhessen or the Palatinate, but to German wine trade as a whole in 1933. So I found both figures way too high. In the course of my more than 20 years of research in the history of National Socialist wine growing on the Mosel, Saar and Ruhr, I was able to find just a dozen Jewish wine shops in the 180 or so wine growing villages in the region. A few years ago, a researcher friend of mine, who was curiously enough and is based in Chile, even explicitly addressed this topic, identifying around 20 Jewish wine merchants on the Mosel and its tributaries, including many smaller businesses, especially as quite a few of them traded in livestock as well as wine. And this happened more often at the Mosel than at the Palatinate. So this means that for the Mosel region, we have reliable figures. And we can say that around 5% of the wine traded there passed through Jewish hands. And although the Mosel is not the largest of the wine-growing regions of Germany, it's also not the smallest either. So if you allow me to be a little polemic, in order to arrive at the 80%, or at least 120% of the wine merchants in the Palatinate must have been of Jewish descent. But I'm just joking. In my dissertation published in 2018 and also in various public lectures a few years ago, I pointed out this discrepancy in the figures, and I warned that regional scientific research on the Jewish wine trade, especially in the Palatinate, would first have to be carried out in order to be able to make reliable statements about the Jewish wine trade as a whole. And I am pleased, irrespective of whether it was actually my suggestion in this regard or whether the time was just mature, this academic gap is now gradually being closed, not at least on this day. However, the obvious juggling with literally questionable figures was by no means the only astonishing discrepancy that I came across in the course of my previous research on viticulture during the Nazi era in connection with the Jewish wine trade. And what is even more shocking is a different finding, completely different finding that was more striking. I called it the great mystery of the Nazi wine propaganda. In my dissertation, for example, I spent more than 500 pages dealing in detail with the wine propaganda in the Third Reich, whereby my final research result was quite surprising, not to say astonishing. So my dissertation was published in 2018. I already mentioned that, and it was sold out for quite a long time. So now we already got the third edition available. I don't know whether it's available in the bookshops, but it is available at the Rhein-Mosel Publishing House. So research topic is Mosel, but the results can be transferred or are relevant for the whole wine growing all over Germany. So in 1935 to 1937, there was a wine advertising campaign going on, initiated by the National Socialists, and was not only the most comprehensive wine sales campaign ever seen in Germany before, but German wine growers were also given a level of propaganda attention by the Hitler state that no other comparable professional group in the Third Reich received. So those are the care messages, the core research results of my work. But they are really astonishing. They are really shocking. And I would have loved to see that in the established wine industry back then. So, but unfortunately, this was not the case. So maybe people don't want to deal with the history of the Third Reich, so I am happy to be able to present this in front of a big audience today. But what does this have to do with the Jewish wine trade in concrete terms? So quite simply, if you relate this knowledge on the largest wine advertising campaign in German history, initiated by the Hitler state of all people, to the significant proportion of Jewish wine merchants who were active in Germany before 1933, it is almost inevitable that this will have a very concrete consequences on the content of the National Socialist wine propaganda. If 80, 60, or even just 30% of the German wine traded in 1933 passed through Jewish hands, this would inevitably have to be the central theme of this very National Socialist wine propaganda, just as the Nazi regime with its anti-Semitic racial mania was ideologically predisposed. Fellow Germans, don't buy German wine from Jews. This should have been the slogan back then, or this could have been the slogan back then. But nothing of that sort happened. Although by 1936, at least every German town from the Rhineland to Hinterpommern was obliged to take a so-called wine sponsorship for one or more wine-growing communities with the obligation to consume as much wine as possible from the respective sponsored wine-growing town within a week under the sign of the National Socialist National Community, which quickly became the popular slogan, "Drinking for the Führer." And although, that was also a headline that I used for my presentations, and not many organizers or hosts don't ask me if I can't take a different slogan, if I can't choose a different slogan, but I think that it is a very catchy slogan. It is a very, this definitely hits the nail on the head, if you ask me. So there was even a general amnesty, for example, if people beat up each other in drunken states or drunken conditions. But you can read the rest about it in my publication. And although all the newspapers in the Reich that were brought into line exuberantly called for the consumption of sponsored wine, only very rarely, and even then usually only hidden in a subordinate clause, there was any defamatory allusion to the Jewish wine trade. So those are the official publications in the press back then. And the what they published internally is that the state does wine propaganda for the suffering wine growers, but those are internal news, internal publications. You find nothing about that in the internal wine propaganda. So those are just internal commands. So only Aryan wine traders, wine growers were allowed to be involved or allowed to be part of it. But so the ordinary people were not told not to buy wine from Jews. And there must be a reason for that. One of these is certainly that figure of 80 or 60% of the German wine passing through Jewish hands is far too high. But even if we were to assume a share of only 20 or 10%, and as I said, the exact percentage could be a matter of for further research, this should definitely have been reflected in the Nazi wine propaganda. Another argument, which has also been formulated in a different context, would be the thesis that the Nazis had already completely eliminated Jewish wine merchants immediately after Hitler came to power. Consequently, a few years later, when the Nazi wine propaganda began, there would have been no need to admonish fellow Germans not to buy their wine from the Jews. And since at that time, as is sometimes claimed, the Jewish wine trade had literally come to a standstill. Well, however, this argument, which I will discuss in more detail later, is also misleading. So, it therefore remains a mystery why the Jewish wine trade is so conspicuously not addressed in the course of the Nazi wine propaganda, or that the Nazis just want to disturb the general festive joy in the Reich with their dark hatred of Jews. Well, certainly not, and we will see later an example where both anti-Semitism and wine-swilling conviviality could even be combined very well with each other. So my answer to solve this complex mystery of why the anti-Semitism surprisingly played no significant role in wine propaganda of the Nazi state certainly seems a paradox at first glance, because it was just not necessary to encourage fellow Germans not to buy their wine from Jews, as virtually no one had ever bought their private wine from a Jewish wine merchant before. So my thesis seems to be a bit provocative at first glance, but it sounds completely nonsense at first. But the key word here is private. So what is often overlooked when many publications of the history of viticulture are analyzed is the conditions, the circumstance that the wine trade, the way from the vintner to the consumer was different, in a completely different way than it's done today. So I have an example of the Mosel, but I think it was the same in the Rhine-Hessen region. So if you want to buy wine today, if you're on a wine-growing region, you see the wine makers, the wine estates, and they've got they showcase their bottles, and this did not happen before. So wine was not available in bottles. Only very few wine estates sold their wine in bottles back then. Only high-quality wines were sold. So the ordinary vintners sold their wine in barrels to the wine merchants on site, and the wine merchant made it ready to drink, first of all. So they had the knowledge, they had the money, they had the technology to turn the wine delivered in barrels and turn it into something that could be that people could drink. So it was not filled in bottles, but it was sold in barrels again to the wine traders in the consumption area. And this is something that's widely overlooked today. So already today in the big cities, we've got wine shops, wine stores, but those are retail stores. So the reason for that was the following. In the past, the transport costs were too high. So if you transported wine back then on carts with a straw, so it was very, very expensive to transport it. So they transported the wine to the consumer's area, the consumption's region, and they also fell under the wine law, of course, and had to follow strict regulations back then. So they could mix it with 49% of wine from abroad back then. So this mixing of wine was very popular back then. And then they introduced wine control. And this is what the Nazis promised when they came into power. So, but this is a different topic as well. I'm not going to go into detail here as well. And this special structure of the German wine trade of that time as a whole was, of course, not without corresponding effects on the National Socialist efforts to eliminate the Jewish wine trade. So, for example, calls for boycott. And this began in 1933. And this raises the question of the percentage of Jewish wine merchants in the consumer areas. And there is still some need for research. My personal first impression is that the share was minimal. But we have to have a deeper look at the figures, but I think we won't end up with 80 or 60%. It will be around, it will be something between 5 or 10%. That is just my assumption. But if we want to take a look at Jewish wine, I think the share of Jewish wine merchants, I think we are rather around 5 to 10%. And this, of course, had major effects on the efforts to eliminate Jewish wine trade. So they tried, for example, to prevent people from going to Jewish wine shops. And so many Jewish wine merchants had difficulties to further exist. And instead, anonymous wine deliveries by rail or truck took place. So this was, they didn't know where the wine was delivered to. And this was all the more true for the recipients in the consumer area in particular. So whether we talk about Jewish colleagues or not, well, nobody could hardly ever see that if something was delivered if you don't check the books. And we had long-standing business relationships, and friendships had emerged between the Jewish wine merchants and their Aryan consumers in the consumption area. One presumed consequence was that the Nazis' call for boycott probably came to nothing for a long time. And so if you got business partners in the consumer area, and there won't be anti-Semites, because otherwise they wouldn't have established that business relationship before. And this is exactly what the corresponding sources document that we will see later. So with regard to the elimination of the Jewish wine trade in the Third Reich, there is an even greater research gap, and which I'm not able to close today, unfortunately. So this brings us to the next legend. In almost all previous accounts of the Palatinate wine growing history during the years of the Nazi rule, and above all in publications on the history of the creation of the German wine route, the reason for the unusual advertising initiative of the Palatinate Gauleiter Josef Bürkel, in addition to the obligatory reference to the devastating wine growers' plight in the final years of the Weimar Republic, is always referred to the official elimination of the Jewish wine trade by the National Socialists, which allegedly began as early as 1933. And of course, the reference to the overwhelming majority of Jewish wine merchants should not be missing. This brings us to the German wine gate. But I have to tell you the story. Well, I remember vividly when I saw the wine gate for the first time, 1988, as a teenager. I came from France through the wine gate, and I felt overwhelmed by the eagle, so that the swastika is placed in such a prominent building back then. That was something that I find shocking back then. But I didn't hardly know that I would be confronted with this later in my life, because this is an important research field of mine. So let's come back to the elimination of the Jewish wine trade. There was a documentation in 2015 on the 80th anniversary of the wine route entitled Der Coup des Gauleiters. The Gauleiters coup takes up this argument in detail, using a case study to report on a Jewish wine shop that was officially ordered to close in 1934. And after the Jewish wine trade came to an immediate standstill when Hitler came to power in 1933, and I quote, came to a standstill, and as a result, the wine growers were left with their unsaleable harvest. According to the theory also circulated here, the brown rulers were forced to develop alternative sales methods. So whereupon the Palatinate Gauleiter came up with the idea of setting up a wine route, which had already been developed by others. As plausible as this founding legend may seem, it does not stand up to closer scrutiny. This is another beautiful picture. Mr. Bürkel when opening the wine route. Mr. Görke opening the wine route. In 1933 and 34, we talked about general legal trade bans and business closures for Jewish wine merchants. So this is purely factual. So it is true that Jewish professionals in the wine trade were also usually forced to vacate their board positions in relevant professional associations in spring 1933. However, the legislative measures of the Nazi regime to eliminate or ban and/or Aryanize Jewish businesses did not begin until several years later, in the wake of the Reichspogromnacht of 1938. And with regard to the case study mentioned in the film, I would therefore like to subject the date of 1934 mentioned for the business ban on Jewish wine is, and I would like to put it to closer scrutiny, if the trading license of the wine merchant in question was actually revoked in this early point of time, I believe that there must be a special reason for this, such as, for example, accusation of wine adulteration, or however justified or unjustified as it may have been. So otherwise, until then, there were only state boycott appeals and the so-called Aryan fellow citizens, and not to buy from Jews or to trade with them. This is a picture showing this. Whether and how these calls for boycotts were already generally followed at this early time, however, requires more detailed investigation, especially with regard to the Jewish wine trade, and especially in view of the special trade routes of German wine at this time that I described at the beginning. However, my source findings so far seem to confirm that all these calls are only gradually being made from around the end of 1935, and thus at a time when the state wine propaganda of the Nazi state had long been in full swing, and Bürkel's German wine route had already been founded. So in December 1935, for example, district president in Koblenz reported to the Reichs- and Prussian Ministry of the Interior in Berlin with ambivalent satisfaction that, and I quote, "the Jewish wine trade, which had brought a large quantity of grapes in previous years, had not submitted any offers at all this year, so that a certain loss of buyers had occurred for which compensation could not be found at first." So formulation in earlier years refers to 1933 and 34. And in the following month, January 36, the district administrator in Zell reported to the Koblenz district president that, and I quote, "a large number of Aryan companies were still doing business with Jews." For example, January 36, for example, in the course of an interrogation at the Zell police administration, it was established that the State Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium in Trier had recently sold a cartload of wine to the Jewish wine merchant Bender in Zell. And of course, the Friedrich Wilhelm Upper School in Trier does not refer to the school that still exists today, but to the winery of the same name, with the same name back then. And the state policy in Koblenz officially admitted on 5th of February 36 that, quote, "it had not been possible to completely eliminate the Jews from the wine trade." And you see that I investigated sources at the Mosel or in the Mosel region. The question is, was it the same situation in the Palatinate? And I received evidence from Dr. Hallmann Preuss from Bad Dürkheim describing a similar situation. But regardless of the question, so again here, this was again a source from Bad Dürkheim, that asked people not to sell wine to Jews or from Jews. So if it says 1933, you see that this document says December 36. And if in December 36 people thought that it's still possible, that necessary that you have to explain it why you should not do trade with Jews, it means that people have done it before or until then, and that colleagues are still doing it. The remark after the sales have been reduced to a minimum could be left aside because there were already calls for boycott in 1933, so they had to explain why they did not comply with these regulations, because they were forced to do business with the Jews. But I think those figures here, and you have to keep in mind that those calls for boycott in 1933, if they would have been successful back then, much earlier, shops would have closed, and we see it in Landau. And this happened in 37-38. But people were worried about the volumes sold by the wine growers, but these businesses took place. That's a fact. But regardless of the question of when exactly the boycott calls against Jewish wine merchants began to take effect, one thing is beyond doubt in this context. I already mentioned it was 1936. As a result of the anti-Semitism propagated by the state, so not one glass of wine will have been drunk less during the years of Nazi rule in Germany. For the innkeeper, retailer, and even for the private consumers, for the producers and consumer areas who no longer wanted to buy this wine from Jewish wine merchants in accordance with the Nazi slogans, it was easy to find a replacement from a so-called Aryan colleague. All the more so since, at least according to my current state of research, he had only purchased his wine from a Jewish wine merchant in the consumer area in a few exceptional cases. But even for the wine merchant in the consumer areas, it would have been possible to find an appropriate Aryan replacement. All the more so since after 1933, quite a few of these Aryan wine merchants used their alleged German ancestry in their targeted advertising to encourage customers to buy from them and not from Jews. So in other words, my conclusion is that the Nazi regime's efforts to eliminate wine had no direct influence whatsoever on wine consumption and thus on actual wine sales. So, however, this does not mean that the Nazis' calls for boycott did not have an indirect impact on the Palatinate wine market in particular. After all, the wine trade played an important role in temporary storage and in particular in financing the annual wine harvest by purchasing grapes, mash, or must from wine growers, often even while the grapes were still being harvested. So that the Jewish wine merchants were already unsettled in 1933 and 34 as a result of the changed political situation, or that their sales actually declined as a result of the calls for boycott, were no longer in a financial position to buy the usual volume of grape products in the fall. So in this context, the complaint of the district president in Koblenz from December 35 should be recalled. We don't know if he was happy about that, but the Jewish wine merchants did not make any offers anymore, so this changed the whole market. So the aspect of immigration also played an important role. So it could be assumed that many wine merchants planned to emigrate and they closed their businesses. So if they saw that there was no future for their business, and so they did not fill their cellars with wine anymore, because with wine they couldn't sell anymore. So this is especially true, and we have to take a look at individual situations, but I think there were many cases where the younger generations decided to emigrate, and of course the parents did not continue their businesses if they did not have successors. But this is something that we should do further research on. So if we talk about a complete and immediate collapse of the Palatinate wine market, in particular in this context, as it is usually the case in relevant accounts, hardly seems justified. So after all, it can also be assumed that the Aryan wine merchants, who now enjoyed increased sales as a result of the calls for boycott, made more purchases from the wine growers from then on. So for the acute sales crisis in spring and summer 1935, which the German wine route was founded for, there were other decisive reasons, namely simply the succession of two record wine harvests, like had never been seen before. So quite a few contemporaries seriously saw this as a sign from higher powers who had been sent by Hitler to them as supposed savior. So this is another story that you can read in my publications. To sell this record wine harvest, huge propaganda campaigns were initiated, and this campaign was so successful that the demand increased, and we needed record harvests to really satisfy this demand. And They, however, did not take place. And in 1937, we achieved very, very high prices, price peaks. And they just checked whether this was correct to increase the prices like that. So the whole situation became a boomerang for the wine growers back then. And the wine merchants, did not benefit from the situation. So one other thing I wanted to mention, which came quite as a surprise, well, to further complicate the issue of the alleged early demise of the Jewish wine trade, it should also be pointed out that there were indeed Jewish wine merchants who were able to multiply their sales in the 1930s, and paradoxically, precisely because of the Nazis. So namely when they focused mainly on the export business. If they had special connections, for example, through family members who had already emigrated to other countries in the West, more than a few obviously succeeded in creating an alternative economic existence in that way, at least for a short time. Plus, Nazi critiques in the US or in England did not want to do without their beloved wine from Germany. So, especially because this until 1938, the Nazis tolerated this wine business. So, of course, it's a bit difficult to find sources, but we've got some sources from the Bender wine shop in Celle. So, business documents prevent the war, but they are in Canada and Israel right now, and I haven't managed to get copies from that. But during my studies, I worked as a free journalist, and I did a report about Mr. Bender for the Rhein-Zeitung, Rhein newspaper. This is the young Mr. Bender who emigrated to the Netherlands back then, and he proudly reports that they achieved record sales. They reached record sales due to his contribution until they had to shut down in 1983. And now it gets even more complicated, but you have to analyze issues like that. And I talked to him, so I think that this is definitely a true source. But I think that it is part of the legend that some Jewish companies, like Sichel Wine Trading, was forced by the Jewish to continue their business because of the income generated by those companies. To avoid any misunderstanding, I do not want to minimize the anti-Semitism of National Socialists and its effects on German citizens of the Jewish faith who earn their living with wine trade. On the contrary, there is no doubt that there was, especially in the Palatinate, in the years before 1933, there was a flourishing Jewish wine trade that was destroyed, that was smashed by the Nazis, and whose members were forced out of their trade by the most brutal means. And in many cases, they were later brutally murdered. I even believe that the retrospective fixation of the Holocaust quickly overlooks the injustice and personal humiliation inflicted on those affected, especially in the early years of the Third Reich, when previously respected citizens were abruptly excluded from the community and could be mobbed or even physically assaulted by anyone who came along. But this should not obscure the view of a scientific examination of the questions raised, especially since, as we all see below, or could have seen if my time had not already expired, the actual perfidy of the Nazi regime in its dealings with wine merchants of Jewish faith or descent is ultimately concealed. Okay, there is one last thing that I definitely want to tell you, but we have to skip the next chapter. Well, this would have been interesting or exciting to hear about as well, but I messed it up. Oh, I'm going backwards. Sorry for that. The wrong way around. I'm holding the remote control the wrong direction. So some aspects are so exciting. I hope I've got enough time to tell you more about that. Those 80% of the German wine trade, you find a figure in the internal documents. And that was in the interest of the National Socialists to make the Jewish wine trade disappear bigger and more mighty than it actually was, because they were not able to keep their promises that they used to win votes before 1933. 80% of the wine goes through Jewish hands. That's what they told people. And this implies that if you want to do better, we need to eliminate them. But consequently, so if a historian comes across that figure and publishes that with good intention, does nothing else than supporting or passing on the National Socialist propaganda. So if you find figures like that in literature, make sure you correct that. So this brings me to the very end of my presentation. I already said that there are no examples for anti-Semitism in wine propaganda, but there are some, indeed, only very few. And I hope I can show 3 more pictures. Well, and here, this is the Grenzlandschau in Bad Kreuznach 1934. And here you see the wine growers' work is perceived very critical, as you can see in this statement. So we don't see any sign of this, any visible sign of this is a Jewish wine merchant or not. But you see wine mixers being hanged, and this is something that also happened in Bonn in 1933. Well, the question is if this caricature, or, well, the story would have been different if you would have done this 5 years before the Holocaust. So we can't say with certainty whether this was a Jewish person or not. So this is a 1933 carnival, and this is again a Jewish wine merchants are made fun of. So, and it says that you get a different. So it says one pot and it refers to one pot Sunday meals. You don't have to explain that. And again, Rhein-Main Wine Day in Mainz was taken over by the Nazis. Big propaganda fest. Here, Jewish wine merchants, we are sitting on the wine barrel. And one other thing that is of interest for the Palatinate region, and I was astonished that this was not very well known. So we've got in Neustadt, the election of the wine queen in Neustadt. It's taking place yearly, every year. And of course, there are political allegations. In 1933 and we had this in the Gleichschalter and the Pfälzer Rekrut. 37, Pfälzer Bomber. Half a year after Guernica, the Air Force showed what they can do. And 35, there was an allegation to what took place at the Nuremberg racial laws that took place a couple of months ago. And you see how the poison of anti-Semitism is being spread here in society. And they are democratically elected, so the participants can vote, can cast their vote, and people did not even feel ashamed. This is the reception of the Gauleiter with the opening of the Deutsche Weinstraße. You've got the Bachels, and you see what's written on the barrel. That's 1 week later, or a couple of weeks later. In Grünstadt, there was a parade, and this is one of the wagons of the parade. Okay, and this brings me to the end of my presentation. And you can imagine that this part that people don't like to talk about, this part of the history, I'm coming to an end, I promise. So if you read a list of the wine names from 1950s, and of course nobody's talking about races, but and ethnical cleaning. So here again, you see the wine names, and here have a look at this again without any comment. It says our racial pure Rassereiner says right in the middle of it, and it has become socially acceptable. And I checked it a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's still the same today. And I think this shows clearly the need for action, and not only here. And now this is really my last slide, I promise that. This is something that I came across during my research project. The Wine Queen was elected half an hour after the racial purity, and so she was a representative for that. So you see the German wine queen as an ambassador for racial purity, racially pure wine. So I just came across this. I just did some research on German wine queens. I already announced a book a couple of years ago. I already wrote 300 pages, and the German wine queen is a pure NS thing. So anything that you hear about the history of German wine queens, well, of course, I always say it was elected for the first time in 1931. We are out of this, and no matter what was elected in 1931 has nothing to do with this wine queen. So I found it in Goebbels. I found it together with Hitler at the Nürnberger Reichsparteitag, and was filmed by Leni Riefenstein. So, but you can read about that. And so the Nazis, so this was definitely a Nazi thing. So I would be happy if I had the opportunity to talk to you about this topic. So my book will be published next year, and I will, we will see if I will ever be allowed to come back to the Palatinate after the publication of my book. But this really brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Just give yourself an opportunity to be invited back, and don't tell all your secrets now. I have more. I know, that's why I mean. If you tell everything, then we won't have to invite you again. 300 pages. You live and feel this topic. But I think we have to come to an end, because I'm sure you have questions on the presentations, and we should use the time that we still have. I'm sorry, this is the interpreter speaking. If no microphone is used in the audience, we cannot understand what is being said. I would like the presenters to come up here and to sit down.
Ein Grund, warum ich auf die Zeit gedrängt habe, war auch, weil Frau Huber gesagt hat, sie muss
Ms.
gehen, und
Huber
ich
said she
respektiere
has
den
to
Hund. Sie hat
leave
nämlich kleine Kinder,
early.
muss die
She has
abholen und
small children
Betreuungsaufgaben
and
übernehmen, ist
needs
auch
to
wichtig.
go
Also von
get
daher
them
herzlichen
from
Dank. Es können
school
keine Fragen mehr an Sie gestellt
and
werden.
kindergarten,
Aber vielleicht
so
das
she
ist
had
noch
to
mal.
leave.
Okay, schönen Dank
We're
fürs Kommen
sorry,
auf
but
jeden Fall.
thank you for coming, and thank you for being here.
Wolfgang Pauli wollten wir auch hier oben haben.
Wolfgang Pauli, please come up stage, and Miss Landy, please come up stage as well, because you presented something as well.
Irgendeiner fehlt noch.
Someone is still missing. Who is still missing?
Die Frau Kohlanger fehlt noch. Die wollte eigentlich, da kommt sie.
Oh, there she is. We have everyone.
Also wir machen das so, dass Herr Ammantraut mit dem Mikrofon durchgeht. Sie stellen Ihre Fragen oder machen Ihre
Please
Anmerkungen.
use a microphone when asking a question or making a comment. Maybe briefly introduce yourself briefly, and then ask your question. We'll start with the gentleman in the green shirt. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We've been together the entire day. My name is Karl Ludwig Schlipp. I am from the northern end of Weinstraße, and I've come all the way because it's so interesting. I used to be a wine grower. I stopped because my daughters did not want to be wine growers, and they did not want to take over viticulture. So this event was really worth it. I have a question to everyone in the audience. Would you like to vote on something? Because I'd be interested in viticulture. Who of you here present is from viticulture? So A, are you a wine grower or were a wine grower? Please raise your hand if you used to grow wine. 4, 5. Very interesting. The next thing, who of you was working in wine trading? Because we heard about traders as well. Is any wine trader here? Mr. Hammer? Please, no, please, no, please, no, please. Please, I would like to stop this voting because we have our presenters here upstage, and I think there are people that have questions, that really have questions. But voting is not allowed, but it was very interesting to see who is in the audience. And I have come. I'm not a racist. I'm not against Jews. My wife's side of the family is Jewish. And I saw from the accounts of my ancestors, they were worried that Jewish wine merchants, they always had hard feelings towards the Jewish wine members. I don't want to hear that. I want to stop it right here. Let me say it. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? A long finger. Please take the microphone away from him. Please take the microphone away from him. I will ask my question soon. Can you switch off the microphone? Thank you. Switch the microphone off.
Okay, hier vorne ist die nächste Frage.
So another question up here. Another question up here in the front.
Das war keine Frage an die Referentinnen
That was
und
not a
Referenten, das war eine
question for the
Meinungsäußerung.
presenters. That was a comment. That was your opinion, and that's why we stopped it. Friederike Münzen, Wachenheim, against forgetting, for remembering. Question to Mr. Lehnhardt. You mentioned that in the 12th century, there were exports of Jewish wine to England. That means that Jews had vineyards, and I was very surprised because I thought Jews were not allowed to have property. Was it possible? Was it possible? Can you explain that? Thank you for that question. When I prepared this, it was something new. It was something surprising. But there is historic evidence that there were smaller family vineyards. For example, Mr. So-and-so in Mainz, that was a lot that was not used. And Jews had vines growing there. It was very, very small, but Jewish wine was produced. And because it was hard to produce wine in England and buy wine in England at that time, there was trade all the way to England. until the Jews were expelled from England. In the 13th century, they were expelled from England and persecuted. There were probably not large quantities or volumes, but just to make sure that the wine was kosher, they imported it all the way from Mainz or from the Rhineland. Maybe there were other villages as well where Jews lived or used to live. No microphone, apologies. Well, they probably owned it, but they also had vegetable gardens for Jews, just for their own consumption. Next question, please. Thank you for all these presentations. I have one question. What about the transition period for bottled wines? When was that? I heard there were delivery notes in Deidesheim of a Jewish wine merchant who ordered bottles, 32,000 bottles, before the Nazi regime. When was that transition to bottled wine? I think I mentioned that bottled wine, I think since Napoleon there was bottled wine. The question is just about the quantities that was bottled. There were not many large producers, but the simple wine grower, the small wine grower, started bottling wine when people came and wanted to buy. In the middle of the 30s, we have large-scale wine bottling from the larger wine estates. But every farmer bottling their wine at the Moselle River is after the war. In the Palatinate, well, I was actually expecting that question. Ms. Kulanger wanted to answer for Landau. Of course, the statement that I made was that the majority of wine traded was in the barrel. There were some in bottles, but the decisive quantities were in barrels. Bottled wine was not sold to private consumers, but rather to retailers or wholesalers or even restaurants. Oh, you have a microphone too that you can use. So, in Landau, we had this industrial rail, and so they were in the barrel. It was wine in the barrel. There's a lot of evidence that on Ostring, the wine merchants, they had huge cellars that you can see today that still have the big barrels and barrel fillings vats. Your presentation explained, or we saw those big carts, and we have images and pictures with large wooden barrels transported towards the station. The main station was outside of the fortified city, so there was a need to transport large quantities from Industriestraße, from Ostring, from Schlachthofstraße, to transport the barrels towards the train station. And that's why the railroad was actually, that the track was developed. The photographs that we have by Heinrich Striefler, that photographed a lot. All the pictures that you see, even on the flyer, are part of this collection. He took pictures of wine tastings with bottled wines. However, they were not taken in Landau. They were rather taken towards the heart region. Here in Landau, I assume that it mainly was barreled wine on tracks. Your questions. Your question?
I would like to ask Ruth Landy.
Sie können das ruhig auf Deutsch sagen, das wird übersetzt.
Please speak in German, and then it can be interpreted. Thank you, Miss Landy. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. It really touched me and moved me. I have a question about your about your grandfather. I don't know whether you will be able to answer. What about Heinrich Levy's estate? Where was Heinrich Levy's estate in Landau? He did not have an estate. He had a trade. And is there still an address today? So the question is, where was that? We can answer it. Neustädter Straße 14, sorry. Microphone. We had 55 live stream participants, so that's why we also use a microphone. The brothers Levi estate was Friedrich Ebert Street 14, today Neustädter Street 14, and the Levi brothers, Hermann, the older brother, in 1918, from a former merchant, a non-Jewish store, he took over, and 4 years later, Heinrich, the brother, Miss Landy's grandfather, Mike and Czech's grandfather, who's not here today, joined. And I just showed the Landys and Zinkels that Heinrich, before that, was for 4 years, he was in Neustädter Straße 8. He lived in Neustädter Straße 8. And then 4 years later, he joined Hermann Levy. And both houses still exist today. And you can still see parts of the remaining industrial track. Ruth Landy would like to answer.
Just to add, excuse me, I'm the only one here who doesn't speak German. There's a reason for that. What we understand from our father's memories is that after the war, the two brothers would take their bicycles and they would go out into the villages. They would buy samples of wine, or I guess they weren't buying grapes, they were buying some wine samples and bringing them back and starting their business in a very simple, modest way. And then as they started to have some success, they were able to enlarge. So that was how they began, but they never owned any land. They were always buying grapes from the existing German growers.
Schönen guten Tag, Rolf Schwürzig.
Ein bisschen näher ran.
Bisschen näher ran. Rolf Schwürzig-Kreuter.
Rolf Schwürzig-Kreuter. I am the wife. I'm the husband of a book that was published by the city. I saw you nodding your head. So my question is, do you know that title of the book? Did you mention the title of the book? It will be published as a paper, and it will have the academic sources as well. Your wife published it, and Ms. Pichotta published it. Of course, I didn't mention all the references in my presentation because that would have taken too long. But as soon as it's published, you'll find your wife. And you'll also find the title and everyone doing research. And your wife will be part of that as well, of course. When in your introduction you said it was really hard to find something on Jewish wine merchants. And if you remember, if you read the book on page 237 to 258, the wine merchants are described and the families are described. Please use the microphone. You can speak in German. It will be interpreted. Please speak into the microphone so that everyone can hear. So, pages 227 to 258 explicitly describes the wine merchants in Landau, where they came from, where they lived. And I think it's unfair to have such a big audience to not mention the book that was published here in the city of Landau, because it advertises Landau's history. And I think it's unfair that you don't mention it. You should have mentioned it. It sounds as if you had researched and written all that. So my presentation was not that I present my findings, but that I'll just give a broad overview. And within the presentation, I wasn't able to cite all the sources that I used. I just summarized. I just gave a few examples from the history of Jewish wine trade. You will find all the quotes and all the research and all the sources in my publication. And you can read up on the dates, but you don't have the economic development of the companies. You don't have annual statements and such of those companies. So you have the life stories of the founders, and you know where the companies were and where they built. But unfortunately, we don't have many economic data backing up the story of the companies. That's why it's hard to speak about the quantity and volumes and extent and economic magnitude of the individual companies from a historic perspective. Unfortunately, there's not that much information. Did you want to comment on that, or you have a question? Ms. Landy, please.
Continue on a positive note. I want, on our behalf of our family, to thank the town of Landau, to thank Mrs. Cole Langer for this incredible work they have done on the history of the Jewish heritage of the town. I don't understand German, but I did see the map that literally mapped all the Jewish wine merchants in the town, and we found our grandfather's estate. And that was a remarkable experience to see that that had been recorded. So thank you so much.
Ist an? Ja. Maximilian Lessig.
Maximilian Lessig, Institute of History and Traditions, Kaiserslautern. I have a question just about the content of a presentation. Thank you. So in the presentations, we heard that there were numerous wine merchants, Jewish wine merchants in Landau, and Ms. Kolanga in the beginning talked about the French period, much about the French period, and that Jews were granted rights during the French Republic that were outstanding for the region and the times. Did that also contribute to the fact that many Jewish wine traders were in Landau already? Because Levi family after after the First World War came here to Landau or settled in Landau. So was Landau more attractive because of the French tradition? People were more tolerant and open? Yes, that'd be nice. I assume that the French Revolution, with the decree that I mentioned, kind of marked the atmosphere a little bit. But, however, I think morality and this patent of morality for the Jewish merchants made sure that lots of these freedoms were revoked. So the reason why they came from villages and settled in Landau was just because the fortress was unfortified. The citizens in Landau wanted to get rid of the walls. They wanted to take down the walls, take down the old rubble and rubbish. And I briefly showed you that it was very fast and quick, and how it developed quickly. And it was kind of like a new atmosphere, a boom, where people from the surrounding villages came to Landau to enlarge and expand. And we have lots of quotes on that. And we just saw that, and there were representative houses with big basements and big residential buildings that they built. And it just shows, and I think that's an important aspect, that the non-Jewish citizenship kind of aligned. It wasn't integrated, that's the word that we use today, but they rather assimilated. They wanted to become part of this German bourgeois society. And this is also part of the symbols. And the symbols here in Landau was the architecture on Ringstraße. And if afterwards, in the coming days or weeks, you go through Ostring, Eastring, you'll see that in front of almost every house there will be Stolpersteine. You have the Stolperstein Initiative. Frau Dr. Greuter joined. She wrote this book. And we wanted to show that, especially in the Ostring, that Jewish merchants marked architecture and city in Ringstraße up until today. Oh, sorry, that was a long answer. I hope that answered your question. I am Margit Nuss. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in Jewish history. I'm a layperson. I just want to thank the presenters. I just want to thank the presenters and organizers for today. For me, it was outstanding. I benefited so much. I learned so much. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. My name is Georg Dumont. I'm the member of the board of the Association Against Forgetting in Wachenheim. And in Wachenheim, it's a little complicated to talk about the houses in Wachenheim and wine merchants in Wachenheim. It's complicated until today because those houses were acquired for a very low price. What about these beautiful houses? What about the ownerships? Were they sold? Were they reclaimed? What was that situation like? So what happened to the houses that were acquired? Back to Landau, that's why. Is it okay for me to answer? Is that okay? So the question of the so-called Aryanization in Landau, a few years ago we published a paper, questions about Landau during the NS regime, and of course it answers the question of Aryanization. The issue is as follows. So non-Jewish Landau citizens didn't buy directly from Jewish citizens. There was a central institute. It was a kind of a bank that you used to buy from. And of course, it was below value, depending on when it was sold. And those files are in the archive in Speyer. They're called restitution files. And there are a few examples that Ms. Dr. Kreutscher mentions in her publications about Jews in Landau. However, this entire issue regarding wine trading after 1933, and I agree with you, because we see that after 36, 37, after the night of the crystal glass, the program night, people were fleeing and running, and they say we have to finally leave and therefore sell their property and their estate quickly. But this is still research in progress. And I realized when listening, I think we're at the very beginning of our research in Landau when it comes to this. There's a lot more to be done in this regard, especially wine trade in southern Palatinate. That would just be the beginning here to say one has to look into it. And Ms. Dr. Klapp of Kaiserslautern is here. We have no university in London, but we have a few historians. And so that publication will be a part and will be important here too. My name is Peter Damm. I am a member of Stolperstein Initiative in Landau. I have a question to Mr. Krieger. In 1910, the Association of German Predicate Wine was founded. German premium wine. Is there material on this, on the association and how they presented themselves during the NS regime? Please, not another presentation. I don't want to say much about it because the association commemorated an anniversary and there's a written piece that you could read up on it. That's the issue, that the NS regime for wine trade, the NS regime wanted to support the producers, and for the consumers, they didn't want luxury good. They didn't want wine to be a luxury good. They wanted wine for everyone, and for that to work out, it could only be on the shoulders of the producers. So that was not a great time for them. You could hear that in the rhetoric too. The wine traders were only wine distributors and not traders anymore. They were called distributors. There's no Jewish benefit in it, no bargaining. They just distribute it. They don't trade with it. But this was actually about stopping wine trading. And at the core of the propaganda, we have the partnership actions where the cities were connected to the producers and bought from the producers. So they tried to circumvent the traders altogether to make better prices. So internally, they were very affected, but wine trade was organized a lot later. And let me add, please let me finish. It was a paradoxon because the person responsible for wine growing didn't like wine farmers at all. He did not like wine farmers because he didn't see them as farmers. Farmers were something that worked with their hands. And wine growers, they were already bargainers, and he didn't like them at all. You can read it in my papers. But the funny thing was that they actually advertised wine. But the Nazis really succeeded in organizing the only international wine builder congress in August 1939. And this is the very first time that you see the person responsible for wine growing at the evening before the wine started. It was only a farce. People did not participate. And 5 days later, the war started. And the Nazis had a wine exhibition and planned. You deviated greatly. But that associations itself, I didn't do research about it as well. You could just read up on it. But in total, when it comes to wine trade in the NS regime, they were not important. And the association, they could just be happy that they weren't dissolved. Thank you. We have a book table. And all the books mentioned, Dr. Marie-Louise Kreuter on Jews in Landau, Landau Jews, has a second edition and will be published next year. We heard your dissertation. We have your dissertation here at the book table. And you can go to Bücherknecht and buy it. But there was another question over here. Ursula Warneck. I'm a citizen of the city of Landau. Miss Landy, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your book. I want to thank your family from the bottom of my heart to travel so far, to come to Germany and encourage us and visit us in these times. You know what I mean when I say in these times. And I want to ask you if you can give us something for us as citizens in Germany. Is there something that we need to consider, something that we need to watch out for?
Thank you. That's a very weighty question. Is this going to be translated into German? Yeah? No? So, you've all been very patient today. You've heard many different things, some very enriching, some contradictory. And I also thank all the presenters and the organizers. So I felt like you are shining a spotlight on something about which very little is known. And gradually, I hope this body of knowledge, like the wine that clarifies and becomes aged and better to drink, that whole process will continue. Tomorrow is Yom Kippur, and if you are Jewish, as the professor you mentioned, it's the most serious day of the year. It's a day of repentance and of trying to be forgiven. I did want to add that if I can speak on behalf of our family, we have family in Israel, and we are worried about them. We also, our heart breaks at the loss of life for the Palestinians in Gaza, for all of the civil populations who are affected. It is a tragedy that is unfolding for all of us. It is a complex situation, not black, not white, and I'm sure you feel affected as well. So I think our hope is that the Christian and Jewish message around love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is something the Middle East is having great difficulty with, it's difficult in Ukraine, is something that we all do our small part to protect our democracy. The lesson for our family was that within 6 months of Hitler coming to power, democracy had disappeared legally in Germany. And we in the US, we are all returning to vote in our own election, which is in early November, as you know, because democracy is also on the ballot in the US. So I think I wanted this book also to be our message and plea, and I said this to the mayor last year, that we all need to play our small part to preserve democracy and try to advance that message that the other is not our enemy, right? And that each one of us has to do that because it's our collective ability to do that that will preserve our institutions and will stop hate of all forms. And I'm sure you share my prayers for peace and understanding in the Middle East and everywhere, and preserving your own democracy, which is so precious.
Ja, meine Damen und Herren, ich glaube, das war das schönste.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that was the best word of closing that we could have ever heard. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you for your questions and comments. I really liked what the ladies said, but I also want to congratulate you. You were a very committed audience. We've been together for hours, and none of you left. And it shows that you're interested and that you're committed. And you exceeded our expectations. The numbers, in the beginning we thought we'd have 50, now we have more than 200. Just the numbers, but also the quality, your discussions, your questions, or the quality of your coming. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Landy. I'm very touched and moved by what you said. I'm touched and moved by our encounter. I look forward to tonight and going to a winery. I wish you a good Yom Kippur tomorrow. Miss Landy will visit a school, which is also very important that we also include the young. Safe travels to you and your family. Stay safe, stay healthy, and peace for all of us.
Und ich bin noch für die profanen Sachen zuständig. Unten an der Treppe steht jeweils.
When you go downstairs, maybe if you say you liked our event, then maybe you can contribute and help compensate our deficit. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Safe travels. And we'll start the guided tours in about 10 minutes. If you have registered for a guided tour, you know where to go. You should know where to go.